Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I'm Brian Calley, the CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Miller. Thanks for joining us today. I'd like to say thank you to our sponsor, Consumers Credit Union. We're actually headed to their Kalamazoo headquarters next week, Thursday, for our Kalamazoo Region Owner-to-Owner Networking event. So if you're in the area, please join us and get to know some of the team at Consumers Credit Union. It has been a very busy week in the legislature, and we have some issues to unpack. Let's start with right to work. What is right to work, and why is this issue so important?
Yeah, right to work is actually a simpler concept than what you might think. It gets tied up in like political arguments over who gets what money, but really what it comes down to is right to work means that an employee decides for themselves whether or not they join or pay agency fees to a union. In other words, it says that you may not make as a condition of employment that a person make payments to a union. And so it's been in place here in Michigan for about 10 years, a big change back in 2012. And you can see what's happened since then, that Michigan really has been on an economic growth period as compared to the decade before that. In fact, I thought I would share, for our interest really in this, we've long since been supportive of letting employees decide whether or not they want to join a union. And we always oppose creating conditions for employment to say that, hey, you may not hire this person unless they do something the government requires or under certain conditions set by the government. We support more freedom in those instances, but economically speaking, there's a lot of reason to consider this as a key business issue. So I thought I'd just run through a few of the statistics on it. So just comparing Michigan before and after it became a right to work state. So 9 years after Michigan became a right to work state, our population actually went up 130,000 people. The 9 years before right to work, our population dropped 120,000 people. So we went from being a shrinking state to a growing state. That's true, by the way, overall, if you look at where people migrated since the pandemic. So 2020 to 2021, according to the United States Census, over 860,000 people moved from non-right to work states to right to work states. Now, this policy is not the only thing that, of course, dictates where people move. In fact, it's not specifically a thing that people I would expect would move for, but it's about people moving to where there's opportunity, where there's growth, where there's a stronger economy, where they can make a living and take care of their family. And so this idea of population growth, we definitely experience here in Michigan, but it's true nationwide as well. We desperately need people. And this is one of those factors that seems to be indicative of where people choose to live. In other words, where there is opportunity and people chase that opportunity. But also looking at the state itself has an interest in this. Before, even figuring for inflation, before right to work, the 9 years before right to work, state revenue dropped 17.9%. After it went up 15.3%, the 9 years after. So just comparing these two amounts of time before and after. Also for the standard of living of each individual of our families in Michigan, the 9 years, again, adjusting for inflation. So you can't say that, hey, this is just an inflationary impact. Adjusting for inflation, in the 9 years before right to work, because right to work has been in place for 9 years. That's why it's a 9-year comparison before and after. Average income went up 0.6%, about 0.5% in 9 years in Michigan in the years before. It is up 21.9% in the years after. And then overall labor force, size of our labor force, it was down 350,000 in the 9 years before and up 90,000 in the 9 years after. And even though we struggle with labor force participation, and even though we've not seen it recover to pre-pandemic levels here in Michigan, it's still over that 9 years has grown compared to the previous 9 years where it had shrunk. So then average unemployment as well. Before it was 8.5, after the 9 years after 6%. Just every economic stat you can think of, Michigan before and after, we are doing much better. And of course, for small businesses where there's this intersection, you need growing communities and an ample workforce in order to reach your full potential. And that's where we look at, it's one of those factors that has become characteristic of a growth state. And that's what we want. We want to be a growth state. We want to be the type of place that will attract people, where people will want to come. And in order to come, you got to be able to have opportunity. And all of the economic statistics that, or at least the top line ones, the ones that get the most attention, the ones that economists pay the most attention to, they really do point to a Michigan before and after, a stark contrast. Where we're much better off now. And I want to make clear, though, that was one of several policy changes that were made during that short time period, 2011, 2012, where Michigan went from being a bottom dweller state to being a solid performer, like at least a middle performing state, after being 48th, 49th, 50th on just about every list in the previous decade. So we made quite a comeback, and it's really a shame to see our state government contemplating policies that would really take us back to mirroring what was in place when we had some of the lowest economic times in Michigan's history.
So walk us through, kind of what's happened this week and what's happening next in terms of right to work.
Yeah, so it's talked about as a done deal. Technically, it's not a done deal yet. It's only passed the House of Representatives. However, it will pass the Senate. It won't get immediate effect, but that won't matter all that much on a bill like this. It's not like the previous bill on the tax bill where there were some important timing issues. So that means that, and then it'll go to the governor, and the governor will sign it. There's a little bit of controversy in that the legislature amended the bill to put an appropriation in the bill. And the reason that they would do that, put $1 million appropriation, the reason they would do that is that from about 20 years ago, the Supreme Court decision says that a bill with an appropriation, a spending bill, cannot be challenged by referendum. Our Constitution says that. And so the question is, can you just take an appropriation and put it into any bill at any amount and have it be referendum proof? In other words, the people of the state of Michigan couldn't overcome it, couldn't repeal it through a citizen's initiative. This happens when the legislature has something, and maybe it can be controversial. Maybe they think that people will rally and try to get it overturned by putting an appropriation in it. Our Supreme Court said about 20 years ago, it makes it essentially referendum proof. So that did get added into the House. In the past, the governor has been very adamantly opposed to eliminating referendums on policy bills that pass, to take that right away from the people. It's not really clear. I was a little surprised when I saw that added in there, because the governor definitely supports repealing right to work and bringing back compulsory union payments, but in the past has not supported any policy bills. In fact, she's vetoed bills in the past because they had an appropriation to avoid referendums. So it's interesting. I guess I'm a little surprised, because there's been such adamant opposition that the House added that provision in. So that'll be a little side drama to follow, but it'll pass the House in one way, shape, or form, with or without this appropriation. It will get the governor's signature and will become law. At that point, it won't likely go into effect until 90 days after the close of session this year. So it'd be spring of next year when it would take effect or go into effect. But here's the other thing that is already kind of starting to brew, and that is the notion of a constitutional amendment to add right to work into Michigan's Constitution. And it is, in a lot of ways, it is fitting for a constitutional provision. So it's a freedom type issue. Should the government be able to tell you, you have to join, you have to associate, you have to make payments to a third party organization in order to have your job? And so other states, including most recently Tennessee, passed a very simple, straightforward constitutional amendment to defend right to work, or to enshrine right to work in their constitution. And polling has shown very consistently over the last 10 years, and this is a very, very widely and commonly polled topic, that people generally like to decide for themselves. They don't want somebody to tell them, hey, you can't keep your job unless you make payments to the union. They want to be able to say, hey, I'm in charge of whether or not I join the union, and I'm in charge of whether or not they're representing me well enough to earn my business for me to pay them to represent me in a union contract. So that is, it's very popular even among union households. Right to work is very, very popular even among union households. Not surprising, as you know, SBAM is a big supporter of right to work, but our members are too. We asked our members about this topic recently, and it was 74% would oppose repealing right to work. So what the legislature did yesterday, 74% of our members opposed, and then a small percentage actually supported, and then there are some that really didn't know enough about the issue. But a wide chasm between support and opposition. And so it's very clear where small business owners stand on this issue, and I expect it'll be kind of resolved through the legislature in short order, but that won't be the end of it. I will be very, very surprised if this does not end up on the ballot in November of 2024.
All right. So with this ballot initiative, are there other factors at play? Like, what are we watching for here?
Yeah, really, we're gonna they'll have, if that materializes, there'll have to be an organization that's formed, a ballot committee that's, and then language developed. It'll have to go through the board of canvassers, and then they'll have to collect signatures, and it takes almost 500,000 signatures to get on the ballot. That is not an easy endeavor, but I think that probably if the legislature follows through and does what it looks like they're going to do, and the governor signs it, you know, I'm not a betting person, but if I was, I would bet on this, on there being signature collection, that it being an issue that makes it to the ballot. And so it could be something that at the end of the day, even though the legislature is taking actions to try to prevent the citizens from being able to vote in a referendum on this law, there's no way to stop citizens from voting if they choose to submit enough signatures from enshrining it in the Constitution. And I'll be surprised if it doesn't end up there.
Okay, let's talk about prevailing wage next. We'll share a little bit of background on this issue and then what's happening in the legislature this week.
Yeah, this is one that actually has, it's the reinstatement of a policy that was in effect in Michigan until 2018. And what this says is that there's the Department of Labor, they do surveys among union contractors to determine what the prevailing wage is. Again, they don't do any surveying with non-union contractors, only with union contractors, and they do the prevailing wage of unions. And the way this law works is it says that if you want to bid on a government construction job, you must pay the prevailing union wage. That's one thing. So it just increases costs generally of public jobs. But the reason that it ends up being exclusionary towards small business is because it requires siloing of functions. And so there'll be a certain wage paid for a certain type of work. And our audience, the small business owners, and you know that you don't have, everybody makes a wage, everybody on your team, they have got a wage or a salary, and they don't have like a job that is narrowly focused within one band of work. People do a lot of different things throughout their day. Small businesses, people do tend to be generalists, and you don't have a big enough staff to say, okay, say you're a construction company, you do framing all day long, but you really can't drill the holes and run the wiring through the frames, because that's a different job at a different rate of pay that has to be accounted for separately. Prevailing wages, it requires a way of doing business that is just incongruent with small businesses. And it means that most small businesses just can't even go after the contracts when prevailing wage is in place. Now, in terms of its overall impact, it's not as big, though, as right to work, because anything with federal dollars already has to be in the prevailing wage. It has to be compliant with prevailing wage laws. There's a federal law called Davis-Bacon, the Davis-Bacon Act, that requires any job that, any construction job that has federal dollars attached, so like pretty much all of the road work, already has to pay prevailing wage, even though Michigan didn't have it. When they reinstated in Michigan, really the main place where costs will go up and small businesses will be locked out, that they're not already today, will be things like maybe a local county that's building a new building or adding an annex on, or a school construction project that is paid for by a millage. The cost of those will go up, and small businesses will be more excluded from that type of work under prevailing wage laws.
And now let's talk about an issue that SBAM does support, which was a change to the Elliott Larsen Civil Rights Act. So tell us more about this. Is there anything new our members need to know here?
Yeah, there was also a vote yesterday that it added LGBTQ protections into the Elliott Larsen Civil Rights Act. This affects basically employment and housing, against employment and housing discrimination. But this was a codification of a decision that the courts already made. So Michigan has had this act in place for decades, my whole lifetime, and so that. But there was a question that went before the Supreme Court and said, our Civil Rights Act today says you cannot discriminate based on the basis of sex, and that was before always kind of interpreted as male, female, like gender, but not things like gender expression, sexual orientation. So that went before the Supreme Court. It started out in a State Department of Civil Rights, and that commission said, no, it's a broader protection. Then it went before the Supreme Court, and the argument was made that this already should be covered. The Supreme Court said, yes, it is already covered. So as of last summer, discrimination was officially banned in housing and employment for those cohorts, for those groups of people, and the legislation codifies that decision. So there isn't really anything new that a business would need to do today as opposed to yesterday or before and after this law gets signed. It's on its way to the governor. Of course, the governor will sign it. But when the Supreme Court passed it last year, then it did require some changes. But our assumption among our members is that, look, our members need workers, need good workers. Our members always want new customers, and so we just don't believe that small businesses are of a mindset to discriminate anyway. This was something that was easy to support. The change in the law, codification of the practice you're already required to engage in. There was some controversy too, and somebody might be watching saying, "Hey, but what about the balance between my religious freedom and this act?" And of course, that's I think a question that needs to be very, very much respected. And so there's a debate: should you put that in this act? Here's the thing. Religious freedom is protected by the United States Constitution. It is not made any stronger or weaker by a state statute. So while I can certainly understand and appreciate those who wanted to put that explicitly in the bill, had it been put in the bill, it didn't make it any stronger or weaker. There's nothing stronger than the United States Constitution, and freedom of religion is already there. So that's the fact that it went through without that type of a provision it doesn't really change the reality on the ground either way. So this was more of a statement or a codification of current practice as opposed to a new thing that our businesses have to comply with.
All right, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about property taxes. They went up about 5% across the board, but tell us more about what this means.
Yeah, property tax is going to go up this year, and they'll go up more than they have since the 1990s. And it's because inflation is so high. So there was a protection put into our property tax system back when Proposal A passed. So you might recall Proposal A was that trade where your primary residence gets assessed. Essentially, the assessments are 50% of true cash value. So the assessments are 50% of the value of the property instead of 100%. But then it was also the point when the sales tax went from 4% to 6%. And it was to fund schools. So we at that point went from a school system that was largely based on property taxes and huge disparities, of course, in values of properties anywhere, which led to huge disparities in schools, to a sales tax system, which evened out schools a lot more, especially as of late. Been a long process, but that's what's happened since Proposal A. But what Proposal A also said was that while you own your home, no matter how much the value goes up, the taxable value, the part that you're taxed on, therefore your tax bill, it can never go up more than 5%. So it goes up by inflation, by CPI, the Consumer Price Index. A lot of times property values go up faster than that. But what this says is that it can never go up, your taxable value while you own your home cannot go up more than regular inflation, not the value of the home, and it's capped at 5%. Well, I mean, inflation hasn't exceeded 5% in a very long time. So even when you see your assessments going up by larger amounts, as long as you stay in the home that you have, that taxable value is suppressed and to inflation. It just happens to be that last year inflation exceeded 5%. So it hit that ceiling, that roof. So you will see a bigger, if you own property, you will see a bigger increase in your taxable value and therefore your property tax bill than you have seen in about 30 years.
All right, in other maybe not great news, Jerome Powell set some new expectations on what we might see regarding interest rates in the future. So what did he say?
You know, Sarah, when we were setting the agenda for this briefing, it didn't occur to me that, yeah, it's like all bad news, I guess, or mostly bad news. So normally it's when the Federal Reserve they do their meeting and they announce their decisions on interest rates and other monetary policy that we learn something. But Jerome Powell, as the chair of the Federal Reserve Board of Directors, went to Congress and testified and basically reset all the expectations that were set at the previous meeting. The previous meeting, they increased rates 0.25% and said that there's going to be future increases. We're not done yet. There's going to be future increases, but that there would be one or two more, that they'd probably be at 0.25%. That was kind of the expectation that was set. Very different yesterday. So with inflation numbers this year coming in stubbornly high and a little bit surprisingly high, and tomorrow there'll be the workforce jobs numbers that come out. If they show what is expected, which is that there's just such a tight labor market, which is keeping costs high, and keeping business costs high means there's cost pressures that are kind of pushing inflation up, that if those numbers come in like expected, well, there's going to be bigger interest rate increases in the future. So that means the cost of capital would further increase. And so I was, whereas I was thinking we're getting toward the tail end and it'd be 0.25% increases in the next couple of Federal Reserve board meetings, it looks like now they're considering 50 basis points, 0.5%, or even 0.75% increases in the future. So more aggressive monetary policy, which does they're afraid of inflation, and they should be. But it also increases, these actions will increase the risk of recession. And we already have a pretty high recessionary risk. So when the jobs numbers come out tomorrow, we'll have those on Data Monday for you. But I think it'll give us a pretty good indication on what the Federal Reserve will do next.
All right, and our last topic for today is General Motors. They recently announced a round of layoffs, and they're also incentivizing separation agreements. So what does this indicate?
Yeah, this is, I think it might get kind of sticky in this whole thing about corporate incentives, like paying incentives to bigger corporations. I think it's going to be kind of sticky that there are two things happening with some major employers in Michigan that got big incentives, General Motors and Ford. So General Motors had an announced round of layoffs, a lot of professional and white collar positions, so higher paid positions, and those were not, they didn't seem to be anticipated. And then on the heels of that, there was an announcement that they're looking for voluntary separation agreements for people that have worked there for 5 years or more. So these aren't early retirements. They're basically looking to increase attrition in order to reduce their overall headcount, reduce their overall workforce and expenses. So the reason I think this becomes kind of a complicated narrative is because both of those companies are making big investments in electrification and battery plants. At the same time, they're looking to shrink their higher paid positions and also, which are more concentrated in Michigan than anywhere else. And then also there's going to be a movement away from combustible engines, which so these, we talk about these like new jobs, but really I think we need to think of them and anticipate they're going to be replacement jobs. They're not really going to turn out to be a net new. It's very likely that just as efficiency, productivity, artificial intelligence, automation, all of that stuff will move all employers, including the giants, will move them toward smaller workforces. And so that's why I think that it's going to be a pretty complicated narrative for policymakers to explain the enormous incentives for the new investment at a time when overall employment and workforce in the state might actually end up shrinking.
All right, that is all the show we have for you today. We appreciate you tuning in. We'll be back here Monday at 3 p.m. Have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everybody. See you on Monday with a lot more then.